Right, mate, so to be clear, you're saying my cat's both alive and dead. Right. I mean, I still don't get why you put it in that box in the first place. I mean, mate, be honest, did you just forget to feed him? Oh, yeah, okay. Showing us bullshit more like. Hey guys, and a very warm welcome to British Guy Reacts. It is so great to have you. Now, I'm going to do something on video for the very first time today, and this time it shouldn't end up in court, so that'll be a bonus. I'm going to watch for the first time an alternative history video, which is a genre I just love, mainly because of what I think it says about real history. I think often we tend to think of history as being very linear, as advancing almost inevitably in a certain direction. I think alternative history shows you just how differently it could have turned out and how relatively small changes. I mean, change the path of bullets here, change someone getting an illness there, and you end up with a very different outcome. So the video I'm going to watch is what happens if America had lost the Revolutionary War, which is obviously a huge question. It has implications for every quarter of the globe. So, I mean, just off the top of my head, some of what I can think of as implications. I mean, America provided a template for revolutionaries all over the world. So, in particular, in Latin America, when the revolts against the Spanish Empire, a lot of those were partly inspired by the American Revolution. In Europe, say the French Revolution was both partly caused by and partly inspired by the American Revolution. In North America, I assume eventually the 13 colonies would have formed an independent state comparable with Canada or Australia or New Zealand, so with a greater constitutional link being retained to the UK. But I don't know if that state would, I'm sure that state would have expanded west, and it probably would have come into conflict again with France and or Spain, and certainly Native Americans. But would it have expanded as fast, as aggressively, and as thoroughly as the United States? I'm really not sure. So I think there'd be a lot more room for the 13 colonies, or British North America, as an independent state, to be significantly smaller and not encompassing anything like the sort of the range of territory the United States does today. And the extra land could potentially be gobbled up by Spain is an obvious candidate. Independent Native American nations is definitely a possibility. So so the implications are enormous. I mean, even for, say, from a more kind of Commonwealth point of view, I mean, Britain, once it lost North America or lost the 13 colonies, obviously not Canada, started focusing much more heavily on other parts of what became the empire. So India, later Australia, New Zealand, South Africa. And a lot of the surplus population went to, in particular, Australia, New Zealand and South Africa. So if they had the option to go to North America, would they have gone to North America instead, as in if they could have gone to British North America? Would so many have emigrated to Australia, say? I mean, would Australia exist? I think it's a really, honestly, I think that's an open question. So we've got a huge amount to get through, and it's actually a relatively short video. So it's, I think, about 5-6 minutes. It's actually quite an old, it's a quite old video from 2014. But yeah, this is a subject I'd like to do a lot more on, but I'll start a small scale, and let's watch the video. So this video is from Alternative History Hub. As always, I will put a link in the description. Go give them some love. And its title is "What if the United States lost the revolution?" So let's go. Very loud intro. That got my attention.
The United States declaring independence from Britain was one of the most monumental events in modern history.
For sure.
The US definitely has had a profound impact on the world for both positive and negative reasons.
I love
Basically, as an American, I could say the revolution still dominates everything in my country. Yeah. It's seen as the genesis, and our culture revolves around those ideas of independence and warfare.
Okay.
But what if this revolution never happened, and the US never existed? How would this change the world? Not surprisingly, a lot.
Yes.
We're not going into the specifics of the cause of the revolution. Basically, for this scenario, no Americans ever wished or decided to revolt and stayed British citizens. No war, no death.
Oh, so that's not quite what I was expecting. I was expecting it to be what happens if the British crushed the revolution, which is a slightly different question. So perhaps if Spain and France had stayed out of the war, and Britain managed to put down the revolution. But I mean, I suppose in that scenario, you'd still have kind of the embers of revolt, and you have a lot of anger amongst the colonists. So in this scenario, there's no revolution, by the sound of things, no prospect of revolution, which is a different question, but I'm sure will have many of the same outcomes.
Declaration of Independence, nothing. Things like the Stamp Act still occur, but no colonists really see a big deal with it and never decide to rebel.
Right.
So on to the effects of no American Revolution. This would be one big list, basically. 1. No United States.
Sure.
Obviously, but not just this. Britain's hold on North America would be very shifted then in our timeline. I mean, no offense, Canada, but Canada. So holding colonies that
That's
range
harsh.
all down
Love
the
to
eastern
Canada.
seaboard would definitely shift international politics. Not only that, but Britain won land.
Oh, so I hadn't realised how much territory France still controlled in the middle of what is now the United States. I suppose that must be the land they gave up in the Louisiana Purchase, or Napoleon sold in the Louisiana Purchase. Kind of makes you think that as the British moved to the west, which you kind of assume they would, even if they hadn't done it so as aggressively as Americans, there would at some point be another clash with the French, because British-French clashing, that's just a thing that happens in history.
East of the Mississippi from France after the 7 Years' War. If no revolution occurred, Britain would have eventually expanded colonies into these lands, but not as fast as the Americans did.
Yeah, I think
Which
that's
brings us
right.
to the people living in these lands. 2. Native Americans. Yay, America! We won the revolution from those Brits. Now we're land of the free, home of the brave, all men created equal. What's this? Indians? No, this won't do. They'll have to go someplace else, where we don't care because we're America.
Yeah, the original
so yeah,
sin.
Native Americans definitely got the worst deal out of the United States becoming a country. Europeans and natives never really got along, but Europeans were always contesting with each other. They never really went after native tribes.
So I think that I'm not quite sure I agree with him that the Europeans never went after native tribes, but I think that's a really interesting point. Is that the Native Americans were able to play European powers off against each other. So in the War of 1812, you had some Native Americans supporting the British, some supporting the Americans. And obviously, the Europeans were playing the Native Americans off against each other in the same way. But I think having one dominant kind of power of European origin, so the United States, rather than having several European powers, was much, much worse for the Native Americans. And the tactics they had used in kind of getting the British, supporting the British against the French or the French against the British, were no longer anything like as viable. So I think that's a really interesting point. But a divided, having the Europeans divided in North America was very useful for Native Americans. And after the United States was formed, I mean, they were still a bit divided, obviously, because you still had, you still had Brits in Canada and the Spanish in Mexico, but it was nothing like as contested as it had been.
Usually siding with tribes against other European countries. However, since the U.S. became its own nation, it had only really one place to go with its resources, and it was west.
Yeah, that makes sense.
We know.
They kind of tried to go north during the War of 1812, and that wasn't a huge success. So, yeah, west is the obvious place to go.
How this goes, but in this alternative timeline, since the US would stay with Britain, simply put, the British wouldn't invest so much time into dispelling the natives as the Americans did. Maybe in these lands that the British now controlled, they would make deals with tribes such as the Cherokee. Colonists would move along the Gulf Coast and into Ohio. Since the Midwest was largely depopulated by the Iroquois in the Beaver Wars, colonization wouldn't be much of an issue. For a long amount of time, tribes such...
I don't know what the Beaver Wars was. That's something I'm definitely going to have to Google the second this video ends.
The Cherokee would remain a driving force in the land they lived in. What is present-day Georgia would be ethnically Cherokee, while on the coast, small population of Brits would occupy village colonies.
So I'm not quite sure if he's saying that there would be independent Indian states, which is what I was kind of assuming earlier, or whether you would have an expanded British North America, which would effectively incorporate the Indian nations in some way. I mean, probably not on an equal basis. I suppose perhaps you'd have sort of semi-independent Indian or Native American nations, which would effectively British puppets. I don't know. I think that's a really interesting question as to whether you get whether or not you end up with independent Native American nations, or whether you just end up with Native Americans being sort of subsumed within the British system rather than the American system. I suspect probably the latter, but I don't know, honestly.
Even if the Cherokee would eventually be withered by disease and loss of land, I believe a portion of the South today would have more native roots instead of simply deporting the Cherokee to Oklahoma, where a large portion are
That
today.
is a really interesting point.
3. France keeps the Great Plains. Since there was never a president to negotiate the Louisiana Purchase or a Napoleon to give the land, talk about that soon, Britain or the U.S. doesn't expand west of the Mississippi. At least for a while. Maybe some alternate war would occur for the land. However, that's doubtful, as much of it looks like this.
I don't know. I think a war would still have been very possible. Just because Britain and France will fight over literally anything. I mean, even today, they're now fighting over very small fishing quotas in the English Channel and around Guernsey. So yeah, I can definitely see an alternative history where a war between Britain and France over the Great Plains
Assuming the
happened.
British
I mean, who wouldn't fight for that buffalo? Come on, I'm sure Britain and France would fight for the buffalo.
never invade the Great Plains, and since the French were light colonists, only really using the land for fur trapping, the native tribes slowly recover from the old world diseases. And
I mean, that's an important point because I mean, one of the reasons why both North and South America were conquered so easily by Europeans was because the indigenous population was ravaged by European diseases. If the process had been slowed down, some kind of immunity should have built up, and you imagine the resistance could have been more fierce, and perhaps less of the territory would have fallen under European control.
become very independent. 4. Napoleon never rules France.
Yeah.
The American Revolution was not just an American event or simply local to North America. It was an international event with forces from Native America, Germany, Britain, and especially France
Love the Germany
coming
picture.
into play. France hated Britain, so if Britain happened
True
to
enough.
lose hold of those colonies, it could benefit France, which is why France was a main supplier and ally of the US rebels.
Sure.
This funding and alliance with the US, however, put the French government in a lot of debt. Along with an awfully horrible harvest due to a bad winter, the king's power began to be shaky. We know how this all went, the French Revolution. This isn't saying the revolution wouldn't happen. This is just saying that the funding of the American rebels was one of the tipping points in the French Revolt. No US leads to a little less debt, leading to a little more stability in the French government. If the US never happened, then the perfect amount of timing which led to Napoleon becoming emperor never would have either.
I think that's almost certainly right. I mean, Napoleon coming to power was in many ways very unlikely. I mean, he was very nearly executed during the Terror. I mean, he was quite lucky to survive. I mean, all the circumstances that have to happen for Napoleon to come to power, the chances of them still happening if the revolution has happened in a different way seem really, really unlikely. So yeah, I think that's a really good point. And the chance of Napoleon become very low, and obviously that has huge implications right across Europe. I mean, it affects everything. Like this pen would probably be a different color or something. Everything would be different.
With this, Napoleon wouldn't have gained the throne and invaded his neighbors.
Right.
Napoleon basically destroyed the Holy Roman Empire, leading to the events which created modern-day Germany.
Yeah,
this
that's
shifted
true.
all of European politics. 5. Everything else. With Napoleon never seizing power at the exact perfect timing, he doesn't become emperor. This literally changes everything in Europe.
Yeah,
Colonies,
that's true.
industry, economy, demographics.
So I think I think there are two main impacts that United States not coming to assistance would have. The first would be that I think European imperialism would have been a lot stronger and more durable. So obviously in North America, a lot of that would be under British control, possibly parts under Spanish or French control. But I think Latin America would stay under Spanish control for a lot longer without the example of the American Revolution for local revolutionaries, people like Bolivar, which is a really interesting subject. And in other places around the world as well, where the American Revolution provided an example for kind of resisting imperialism. But also, once the United States established a certain strength via the Monroe Doctrine, it effectively kept European imperialism out of North and South America, largely. I mean, not completely. Canada being the big exception, and also there being some kind of enclaves in Latin and Central and South America. But they were generally pretty successful. So if they hadn't done that, you have to assume that North and South America would have been playthings for European imperialism in the 19th century in just the same way that every other continent on the planet was. Also, the other big impact, I think it would boost authoritarianism. So, I mean, obviously, America provided a liberal model, a liberal template that lots of countries copied. I mean, it wasn't initially perfect, obviously. It didn't apply to African Americans, very sadly, but it was still a step above what most countries were offering. So I think that not having that and possibly not having Napoleon would lead to more authoritarian political systems would be able to survive for longer. So, I mean, if France retains its position as a kind of authoritarian Catholic monarchy, that would have huge implications. So, yeah, I think there's a good case to be made that the United States not coming to resistance would be a huge blow for liberalism around the world. I mean, as I should say personally, as a Brit, even though I'm going to betray my ancestors here, I definitely think the United States becoming independent was a net positive for world politics. I think in terms of the model it offers was very attractive, even if clearly imperfect. So yeah, I mean, feel free to disagree in the comments. Hashtag Benedict Arnold did nothing wrong, but that's my take on it.
So much of what we attribute to modern day Europe was put into effect by Napoleon's invasions.
Right.
What do you think would have happened had the US lost a revolution? Tell us in the comments. Like us on Facebook and subscribe if you have not done.
Yeah, no, that was really interesting. I'd actually love to watch a more in-depth video if there is one. So if you know of any, please send them to me. If there's any other alternative history videos you'd like me to react to, I love the genre, so I'd love to do some more. And yeah, please put in the comment section what you think would have happened. As this guy said, I'm just going to nick that. What you think would have happened if there had been no American Revolution. And I really look forward to seeing you for the next video. Thank you.